The land had been in Leonard Parker's family for nearly a century, 80 acres of open pasture, oak trees that had stood longer than the town itself, and a winding creek that sparkled in the morning sun. His grandfather had built the original ranch house by hand, every nail hammered with calloused fingers, every plank of wood carried in from the forest. Leonard had grown up there, chasing after cattle, fixing fences, and learning from his father that land was more than property. It was legacy. It was dignity. When Leonard inherited the ranch, he swore to preserve it. But over the years, the quiet outskirts of town changed. Wealthy newcomers moved in, bringing with them manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes, and the mindset that everything and everyone should be kept in line. By the time the Brookhaven Estates Homeowners Association was formed, the surrounding pastures had been replaced with sprawling houses and private road signs. Leonard's ranch sat just beyond their boundary, but his driveway crossed a small corner of the HOA's development before winding into his property. For decades, no one had cared. Until one day, they did. It started with a letter, stiff, officious, and laced with thinly veiled hostility. For the safety and privacy of Brookhaven Estates residents, it read, "We will be installing a security fence across the east access road. A gate will be available for authorized residents." Leonard wasn't a resident, according to them, despite his family's presence on that land long before their development existed. He was, in their eyes, an outsider who happened to live in the middle of their perfect picture. Leonard went to the next HOA meeting, wearing his best Stetson and a pressed button-down, hoping to speak reasonably. But as he stood in that fluorescent-lit room, every eye in the place felt like it was weighing him, measuring him against some unspoken standard. When he explained that the road they planned to fence was his only access to the ranch, the board president, a tall, silver-haired man named Greg Whitman, smiled a polite, empty smile. "We understand your concern, Mr. Parker," Greg said, "but this is about community security. I'm sure you can find another way onto your property." Leonard bit back his frustration. "The only other way is through 2 miles of rocky pasture and across the creek." "You're talking about cutting me off from my own home." Greg's smile didn't waver. "We'll give you the code to the gate, of course. But only until we can sort out a more permanent solution." A permanent solution. The word stuck with Leonard all the way home, bouncing around in his mind like loose gravel. 2 weeks later, without further discussion, the fence went up. Black wrought iron stretching across the road, topped with spikes, a keypad mounted beside it. Leonard tried the code they'd given him. It didn't work. He called the HOA office, no answer. Called again. Nothing. That night, he had to leave his truck parked on the other side of the gate and walk a mile in the dark back to the ranch. Each step felt heavier than the last. It wasn't just the inconvenience. It was the insult. The deliberate message, "This isn't your space. You don't belong here." For a man who had spent his life respecting others' boundaries, it was a bitter thing to be denied his own. But Leonard wasn't the kind of man to shout or threaten. He believed in measured steps, in letting his actions speak louder than his words. So he started asking questions. Through a local real estate agent he'd known for years, Leonard learned something interesting. The small strip of land where the gate stood didn't actually belong to the HOA. It belonged to a private owner, a family who had moved away and was quietly looking to sell. The HOA had been leasing the right-of-way for years but hadn't bought it outright. Leonard saw his opportunity. He made some calls. Arranged a meeting. Sat at a worn kitchen table in a farmhouse 2 towns over, shaking hands with an elderly couple who still remembered his father from cattle auctions. They wanted the land sold quickly, no fuss. Leonard offered fair market value and paid in cash from the savings he'd been setting aside for a new barn roof. The paperwork was finalized in less than a month. Leonard now owned the narrow strip of land containing the only road into Brookhaven Estates from the east and the iron gate that stood across it. The next morning, he walked down to the gate with a small brass key in his pocket. The HOA's keypad was still there, mounted neatly on its post. Leonard didn't touch it. Instead, he opened the control box, changed the lock, and removed the keypad entirely. In its place, he installed a simple padlock and a heavy chain. Only one key existed. And it was in his pocket. When the HOA president called, his voice was clipped and furious. "Mr. Parker, we need access to that gate immediately. You can't just." Leonard interrupted, his tone calm but unshakable. "Actually, Greg, I can. The gate is on my property now. And I decide who uses it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "This is going to cause problems," Greg finally said. Leonard leaned against the fence, looking out over his pasture. "Maybe. But I think you've had your way long enough." By sunset, word had spread through Brookhaven Estates. Some residents came down to see for themselves, standing in small clusters, whispering. Leonard didn't explain, didn't argue. He simply tipped his hat and went back to work in the barn, the sound of the chain clinking softly in the warm evening air. What the HOA didn't yet realize was that Leonard had no intention of using the gate to punish anyone. He just wanted the same respect they demanded for themselves. But they had started this with arrogance and exclusion. Now they would have to come to him, key in hand, if they wanted to pass. By the end of the week, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. The invitation was delivered to Leonard's mailbox by hand, written with the kind of formal politeness that barely covered the tension beneath it. He didn't respond immediately. He let the paper sit on his kitchen table for 2 days, right beside his father's old pocketknife, before deciding he'd go. Not because they demanded it, but because he wanted to see the looks on their faces when they had to speak to him as the owner of something they thought they controlled. The meeting hall was packed. Word of the gate situation had spread beyond Brookhaven Estates, and even a few local reporters had shown up, curious about the story of a black rancher locking out a wealthy gated community. Leonard walked in wearing his work clothes. Jeans, boots caked with dust, and the same Stetson he'd worn at every cattle auction for 30 years. He didn't need a suit to make a statement. His presence alone did that. Greg Whitman, the HOA president, cleared his throat and began. "Mr. Parker, we appreciate you joining us. This situation with the gate has caused significant disruption. Residents are concerned about emergency access, deliveries, and guest entry. We need to restore the keypad in shared use immediately." Leonard stood quietly for a moment before answering. "When you put that fence up, you didn't give me shared use. You gave me a code that didn't work and left me locked out of my own home. I walked a mile in the dark because of it. And when I tried to talk to you about it, you brushed me off. So forgive me if I'm not rushing to fix your inconvenience." Murmurs filled the room. A few residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Greg's smile was tight. "We acted in the interest of community security. Surely you understand." "No," Leonard said, his voice steady but firm. "I understand something else. I understand that for decades, my family has lived here in peace. I understand that you saw me as someone you could box out without consequence. And I understand that now, you're sitting here asking for access to something that doesn't belong to you. That's what I understand." From the back of the room, a woman raised her hand. "Mr. Parker," she asked hesitantly, "are you going to keep the gate locked forever?" Leonard looked at her, then at the room full of faces, some defensive, some curious, a few embarrassed. "That depends," he said. "If you can treat me and my property with the same respect you expect for yours, then we can talk about arrangements. But I won't go back to the way things were. Not after you showed me exactly how you see me." Greg leaned forward. "So what do you want?" Leonard took his time answering. "I want an acknowledgement that what you did was wrong. I want a written agreement that guarantees my access to my own home without interference. And I want a say in any future changes that affect my property. That's the price for a key to the gate." The room went still. Greg's face flushed, but he knew the reporters were watching. "We'll need to review this with legal counsel," he muttered. "You do that," Leonard replied, turning to leave. "The gate stays locked until then." Outside, the summer air was thick, the evening sky painted in orange and purple. Leonard walked back toward the ranch with slow, steady steps. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't afraid of one either. This was about more than a fence or a road. It was about a man's right to stand on his land without having to prove he belonged there. Days passed. A few residents approached Leonard quietly, offering apologies, even support. One older couple brought him a pie and said they remembered when his father used to help their family mend fences after storms. They told him they never agreed with how the HOA handled things. Leonard thanked them, but kept his key close. A week later, Greg showed up at the ranch. No cameras this time, no audience. Just him, looking tired and slightly less polished than usual. "We've spoken to legal," he said. "We'll meet your terms. You'll have full, unrestricted access, written into our community bylaws. And I'll make a statement at the next meeting." Leonard studied him for a long moment. "That's a start," he said finally. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the brass key, and handed it over. "One for you. Keep the chain. I'll keep a spare." When the next HOA meeting rolled around, Greg kept his word. In front of the board and the residents, he acknowledged that their actions had been wrong, rooted in assumptions that had no place in a community. It wasn't an apology that would undo what had happened, but it was a public admission, and that mattered. For Leonard, the victory wasn't about owning the gate or holding the key. It was about turning a quiet act of exclusion into a loud reminder that dignity doesn't need permission. His grandfather's land would remain his, untouched by their petty lines and polished fences. And the next time anyone thought to shut him out, they'd remember the man who bought the road out from under them. That night, as the crickets sang in the dark and the creek whispered through the pasture, Leonard sat on his porch with a glass of sweet tea. The chain on the gate clinked softly in the distance, a sound that no longer carried bitterness, only the knowledge that sometimes, the best way to break down a wall is to own the ground it stands on.